Sarah Smith, Words That Set Us Free. The story of a humble teacher who found her calling behind prison walls. My name is Emily Harrison. I'm 38 years old, and just 3 months ago, I learned a story that completely changed my understanding of who I am and where I come from. It happened after my grandmother Dorothy's funeral. Mom and I were sorting through her belongings in the old house on the outskirts of Columbus, a house that had belonged to our family for 4 generations. In the upstairs closet, behind stacks of blankets and winter coats, Mom found a battered wooden box tied with a faded ribbon. Mom froze when she saw it. Her face became strange, a mixture of sadness, shame, and something else I couldn't identify. She said this was our family's story, one we had never told. It was time. We went down to the living room, and Mom carefully untied the ribbon. Inside were yellowed letters, newspaper clippings, several photographs, and a stack of documents written in neat 19th century handwriting. On top lay a sheet of paper with the inscription, "For future generations of the Smith family, the truth about Sarah." I asked who Sarah was. Mom sat across from me and took my hands in hers. Sarah was the sister of my great-great-grandmother Mary. She died in 1932, long before Mom was born. But her story had haunted our family for more than a century. Then Mom told me what changed everything. Sarah Elizabeth Smith was born February 12, 1864, in Lancaster, Ohio, into a family that knew real need. Her father, Jeremiah Smith, worked as a railroad clerk, and her mother, Mary Catherine, was a homemaker who could create miracles from nothing. Mom showed me an old photograph of the 2-story house by the railroad tracks where they lived with Sarah and her 3 younger brothers. Money barely covered food, let alone books or toys. But Sarah was a special child. By age 4, she could read, having taught herself by studying an old Bible and matching letters to sounds she heard in church. By 7, she was teaching the alphabet to her younger brothers, using pieces of coal to write letters on the fence. A neighbor wrote about Sarah, "This girl isn't like other children. While the rest play with dolls, she reads everything she can get her hands on." Yesterday, I saw her memorizing pages from the almanac because she couldn't take it home. Sarah's love of books led her to the town library, where she met Mrs. Eleanor Whitman. This stern but kind woman became Sarah's mentor, letting her work at the library on Saturdays in exchange for the chance to read. When Sarah turned 16, Mrs. Whitman did something incredible. She spent her own savings to send Sarah to teachers' college. At 18, Sarah returned to Lancaster as a certified teacher. She was assigned to the Elm Street Church School, a modest building serving children of factory workers and farmers. The school had 2 rooms, 43 students ranging from ages 6 to 14, and a leaking roof that required buckets during rainstorms. Sarah's annual salary was $280, barely enough to rent a tiny room above the bakery. But Sarah had never been happier. Every morning she walked to school with quiet determination, arriving early to light the stove in winter and sweep the floors, staying late to prepare lessons by lamplight. Her students adored Miss Smith. She had a gift for making even the most reluctant learner feel special. When young Billy Henderson, son of a day laborer, struggled with reading, Sarah didn't shame him. Instead, she discovered he could identify any bird by its call and used his love of nature to teach him letters. She could explain the most complex mathematical concepts through stories, turning addition into adventures and subtraction into mysteries. Her voice became especially gentle when she read aloud, transforming the cramped classroom into distant lands and magical kingdoms. For 6 years, Sarah's life followed a peaceful rhythm. She taught her students, helped struggling families with correspondence, and spent evenings reading and preparing lessons. She was respected in the community, though some whispered that it was unnatural for a woman her age to remain unmarried. She had suitors. David Matthews, the bank clerk, called on her regularly, bringing flowers and speaking of marriage. Samuel Porter, the minister's son, made his interest clear. But Sarah politely declined them all. She had found her calling, and it filled her life completely. But fate had prepared a meeting for Sarah that would change everything. It was a crisp Sunday morning in late September, 1898. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the countryside in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah had arrived early at the First Methodist Church, where she taught Sunday school for the younger children. As she arranged her Bible stories and prepared her lesson, she noticed unusual activity in the churchyard. A group of men in striped uniforms was working on the church roof, replacing shingles damaged by the previous week's storm. They were supervised by Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley. The prisoners were from the county jail, brought in for community service work. After Sunday school, Sarah lingered in the sanctuary, helping arrange flowers for the evening service. That's when she overheard a conversation that would haunt her dreams. One of the prisoners, a man of perhaps 40, with graying hair and weathered hands, sat on a pew near the back of the church. He held a Bible in his lap, open to the book of Psalms. His lips moved silently as his finger traced along the lines, but Sarah could see his frustration growing. The prisoner muttered to himself about not understanding the words. Deputy Bradley approached and asked what was wrong. The man, whom Bradley called Peterson, explained with embarrassment that these words might as well be Chinese for all the sense they made to him. Peterson continued, his voice heavy with longing, about his 7-year-old daughter, who was learning to read in school. Her mother wrote him letters about how smart the child was. But when he wanted to write back, he couldn't. He had to ask someone else to write for him, which made a man feel small. He kept thinking that if he could read the Bible, maybe he could understand better what the preacher talked about on Sundays. Maybe he could write to his little girl himself, tell her how sorry he was for what he had done. Sarah's heart clenched. She thought of her own students, of how their faces lit up when they successfully read a new word or wrote their first complete sentence. She thought of the power of literacy, not just to convey information, but to connect human souls across distance and circumstance. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She paced her small room above the bakery, the floorboards creaking under her feet. She kept thinking about the man in the church and the longing in his voice when he spoke of writing to his daughter. She thought about all the prisoners who passed through the county jail. How many couldn't read? How many had children they couldn't write to? Job applications they couldn't fill out? Legal documents they couldn't understand? How many were trapped not just by prison walls, but by the bars of illiteracy? By dawn, her decision was made. Sarah spent the next week crafting a letter to Sheriff Morton Hendricks, a man she knew by reputation but had never met personally. She wrote and rewrote it, trying to strike the right tone between respectful and persuasive. She finally wrote to request permission to provide literacy instruction to inmates at the county jail. She was a certified teacher with 6 years of experience and would provide this service free of charge on Sunday afternoons. She believed education was a cornerstone of rehabilitation, and that helping these men learn to read and write could aid in their successful reintegration into society upon release. Days passed with no response. Sarah tried to focus on her regular teaching duties, but found herself distracted, checking the post office every afternoon after school. Finally, she decided to write a second letter, more personal than the first. She wrote about recently witnessing a prisoner struggling to read from the Bible and expressing deep regret about being unable to write to his young daughter. As a teacher, she couldn't bear to think of human beings trapped not only by their circumstances, but by their inability to access the written word. She wasn't asking for special privileges or payment, only the opportunity to serve those whom society had forgotten. The second letter met with silence as well. Sarah wrote a third, even more impassioned than the first two. In it, she quoted scripture about visiting those in prison, cited statistics about illiteracy rates among criminals, and promised to follow all security protocols. 2 months after her first letter, just as Sarah was beginning to lose hope, a reply came. It was brief and grudging. She could conduct a trial literacy class at the county jail on Sunday, October 15th at 2 p.m. If this proved disruptive to jail operations or security, the privilege would be revoked immediately. She would be escorted at all times and could bring only approved materials. Sarah's hands shook as she read the letter. She had gotten her chance, one chance to prove that education could flourish even behind bars. On the appointed Sunday, Sarah arrived at the Lancaster County Jail carrying a canvas bag containing chalk, a small slate board, 5 basic primers, and her worn Bible. The jail was a forbidding brick building with narrow windows and an iron gate that clanged shut behind her with the finality of a coffin lid. Sheriff Hendricks met her in the hallway, a large man with steel gray hair and suspicious eyes. He made the rules clear. She would conduct her lesson in the recreation room under Deputy Bradley's supervision. No physical contact with prisoners. No passing of notes or messages. Any disruption, and she was out. She was led through a maze of corridors that smelled of carbolic soap and despair. The recreation room was a spare chamber with whitewashed walls, a few wooden chairs, and one rickety table. Sunlight filtered through barred windows, casting prison shadow patterns on the floor. 5 men sat waiting for her, their faces showing various degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and hope. Sarah recognized Peterson, the man she had overheard in church. The others were strangers. A young man who couldn't have been more than 20. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and work-worn hands. An older man with a gray beard. And a thin, nervous-looking fellow who kept glancing toward the door. Sarah began by setting her bag on the table with deliberate calm. She told the men her name was Miss Smith, and she was there to teach anyone who wanted to learn. Reading and writing weren't just about words on a page. They were about freedom. The freedom to communicate with loved ones, to understand the world around them, and to imagine a different future for themselves. The young man, who said his name was Charlie Morrison, snorted and asked what was the point. He'd be out in 6 months, and no one would hire a man with a record anyway. Sarah asked how he would fill out a job application if he couldn't read it? How he would know what he was signing? And what if he wanted to write a letter to someone who cared about him? Charlie said there was nobody who cared about him. Sarah replied with quiet confidence that there would be, and when that day came, he'd want to be able to tell them about the man he'd become, not just the boy who made mistakes. She turned to the slate board and wrote the alphabet in careful, clear letters. They would start at the beginning, but first she wanted each of them to tell her why they were there, not their crime, but their reason for sitting in that room today. Peterson cleared his throat and said he wanted to write to his daughter. She was learning to read, and he wanted to be part of that. A middle-aged man named Robert Chen said he came to America 20 years ago, but never learned to read English properly. He figured it was about time. The older man with the gray beard said his name was William Foster. He had been a teacher himself years ago, before he lost his way. Maybe helping others learn would help him remember who he used to be. The nervous man mumbled something about wanting to read the Bible, and finally, Charlie Morrison grudgingly admitted that maybe he'd like to know what was in the newspapers, what was happening in the world. Sarah smiled, feeling a familiar warmth in her chest. The same feeling she got when one of her young students had a breakthrough. Then they began. That first lesson was simple but profound. Sarah taught them to recognize and write their own names, explaining that a signature was more than just marks on paper. It was a declaration of identity, of existence, of worth. When Robert Chen successfully wrote Robert for the first time, his eyes filled with tears. In China, he had been a scholar, he said softly. Here he was just a worker. But now, maybe he was a scholar again. By the end of the hour, each man could write his name and recognize several basic words. As Sarah packed her materials, Peterson approached her hesitantly and asked when he might be able to write a letter to his little girl. Sarah considered the question seriously. With practice and dedication, perhaps in 3 months he could write a simple letter. In 6 months, he could write anything he wanted to say. Hope blazed in Peterson's eyes like a candle in the darkness. The following Sunday, Sarah returned to find all 5 men waiting for her, along with 3 others who had heard about the lessons. Word was spreading through the jail. Sheriff Hendricks watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Week by week, the group grew. Men who had been written off by society discovered they could learn, could grow, could change. Sarah brought different materials each week: children's books, simple poems, newspaper articles about local events. She taught them to sound out words, to understand sentence structure, to express their thoughts on paper. The transformation was remarkable. John Peterson, the man who had struggled to read the Bible, began writing weekly letters to his daughter. His first effort was halting and full of spelling errors, but it was entirely his own. When Peterson received a reply dictated by his daughter to her teacher, he wept openly as Sarah read it aloud. Robert Chen progressed rapidly, his scholarly background in Chinese helping him grasp English grammar concepts. He began helping other students, becoming Sarah's unofficial assistant. William Foster, the former teacher, slowly emerged from whatever darkness had claimed him, finding purpose in helping his fellow inmates discover the joy of reading. Even Charlie Morrison, initially the most resistant, found himself drawn into the world of words. He discovered a talent for writing simple poetry, crafting verses about life behind bars that were both heartbreaking and hopeful. Sarah carefully preserved every poem, every letter, every exercise in a growing collection that she kept in a wooden box under her bed. Each piece of writing represented a victory over despair, a step toward redemption. By winter of 1899, Sarah was teaching 37 men across 3 different sessions. She had reorganized her entire life around the prison schedule, spending her weekends traveling between facilities and her evenings preparing lessons. The physical demands were exhausting, but the emotional rewards were immeasurable. Local newspapers began to take notice. The Lancaster Gazette ran a small article describing Sarah's work in glowing terms. Donations began to trickle in. Used books from church congregations, writing materials from women's auxiliary groups, and small monetary gifts to help cover her transportation costs. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, Sarah's old mentor from the library, was one of her strongest supporters. What Sarah was doing, she said, was what teaching was truly about. She wasn't just instructing, she was transforming lives. But support was not universal. Some members of the community viewed Sarah's work with suspicion and disapproval. Letters to the editor questioned the wisdom of coddling criminals and suggested that Sarah's time would be better spent teaching deserving students. One particularly nasty letter, signed only as a concerned citizen, questioned Sarah's moral character for spending so much time in such company, and suggested she should reconsider her priorities before corrupting herself beyond redemption. Sarah read these criticisms with sadness, but continued her work undeterred. She had seen too much transformation, too much hope awakening in forgotten men, to be dissuaded by small-minded prejudice. The year 1900 brought new challenges and opportunities. Sarah's program had grown beyond anything she had imagined, and she was struggling to meet the demand. She applied for and received a small grant from the State Education Department to expand literacy programs in Ohio's prison system. This official recognition led to an invitation to speak at the State Teachers Conference in Columbus. Standing before an audience of 300 educators, Sarah spoke passionately about the connection between education and rehabilitation. She told the assembled teachers that she had seen hardened criminals weep with joy at writing their first letter home. She had watched illiterate men discover poetry, mathematics, and philosophy. These were not different from the students in their regular classrooms. They were simply students who had been failed by the system earlier in their lives. It was never too late to learn, never too late to change, never too late to hope. The speech was met with enthusiastic applause, and Sarah returned to Lancaster with invitations to expand her program to 3 additional counties. She was becoming something she had never sought to be, a pioneer in prison education reform. But with recognition came scrutiny. In 1902, a new county commissioner, Harold Blackwood, was elected on a platform of fiscal responsibility and law and order. He viewed Sarah's program as an unnecessary expense and a dangerous precedent. Blackwood declared at his first county meeting that criminals belonged in prison to be punished, not to be educated like gentlemen. They were creating a situation where crime paid better than honest work. Despite Blackwood's opposition, Sarah's program continued to grow. She now had volunteer teachers helping her, women from local churches who had been inspired by her example. Together, they were reaching nearly 100 inmates across 5 facilities. The success stories mounted. James Murphy, convicted of burglary, learned to read well enough to study law books and eventually won an appeal of his case. Thomas Brennan, a former alcoholic, discovered a talent for mathematics and became the jail's unofficial bookkeeper. Samuel Washington, one of the few black inmates, learned to read and write well enough to teach Sunday school when he was released. Each success strengthened Sarah's conviction that education was the key to breaking the cycle of crime and poverty. But each success also made her more visible to those who opposed her work. In 1903, the situation became more complicated with the appointment of a new sheriff. Morton Hendricks had retired, and his replacement was George Helms, a man with very different ideas about prison management. Helms was 35 years old, ambitious, and politically connected. He had been a guard at the state penitentiary before coming to Lancaster, and he brought with him a philosophy of strict discipline and minimal coddling of prisoners. At their first meeting, Helms made his position clear. He respected what Sarah had tried to do, but he believed in a different approach. Prisoners needed to learn discipline, not literature. They needed to understand that actions have consequences, not that society owed them an education. Sarah replied carefully that surely he could see the results of the program. Their recidivism rate was 40% lower than the state average. Men who learned to read and write were far less likely to return to crime. Helms responded that statistics could be manipulated. What he saw was prisoners getting special treatment that made them think they were entitled to comfort and consideration. That wasn't justice, that was mollycoddling. Despite his personal opposition, Helms couldn't immediately shut down Sarah's program. It had too much community support and state backing. But he began implementing restrictions designed to make her work more difficult. Lesson times were reduced from 2 hours to 1 hour. The number of books that could be brought into the facility was limited. Security protocols were tightened to the point of harassment. Sarah adapted as best she could, but the constant friction was wearing on her. She began to suffer from headaches and insomnia, the stress of fighting for her program while maintaining its quality taking a physical toll. The year 1904 brought a new crisis. The state legislature, under pressure to reduce costs, began cutting funding for prison programs. Sarah's small grant was eliminated, and she was once again paying all expenses from her teacher's salary. Worse, enrollment in her regular teaching job was declining as families moved away from Lancaster in search of better opportunities. The school board informed Sarah that they might have to reduce her hours or eliminate her position entirely. Faced with financial hardship and institutional opposition, a lesser person might have given up, but Sarah's commitment only grew stronger. She took on tutoring work in the evenings to supplement her income. She organized fundraising events at local churches. She wrote letters to civic organizations across Ohio, seeking support for prison education. Her efforts paid off. The Lancaster Women's Club raised $200 for books and supplies. The Methodist Church organized a monthly collection for the prison literacy program. Individual citizens began sending small donations, often accompanied by notes of encouragement. By 1905, Sarah was operating what amounted to a full prison education system. She had 15 volunteer teachers, a library of over 500 books, and students in 8 different facilities across 3 counties. The Word and Grace program had become a model for other states, but personal sacrifice was taking its toll. At 41, Sarah looked older than her years. Her hair was streaked with premature gray, and she had developed a persistent cough that worried her friends. She had never married, had no family of her own, and had devoted everything to her calling. Dr. Marcus Webb, the county physician who volunteered his services at the jail, was concerned about her health. After she collapsed during a lesson, he told her she couldn't continue at such a pace. She was giving so much of herself that there wouldn't be anything left. Sarah replied weakly that there was always something left, as long as there were people who needed to learn. The year 1906 brought both triumph and tragedy. Sarah was invited to Washington, D.C., to speak before a congressional committee on prison reform. Her testimony was eloquent and well received, leading to the inclusion of education funding in a federal prison reform bill. But personal loss shadowed her professional success. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, Sarah's mentor and dearest friend, died of heart failure in December. At the funeral, Sarah realized that she had lost not just a friend, but the person who had set her on the path that defined her life. The loss of Mrs. Whitman seemed to mark the beginning of a darker chapter in Sarah's story. Sheriff Helms, emboldened by political changes in the county, began actively working to undermine her program. In early 1907, he issued new regulations requiring all volunteer teachers to undergo extensive background checks and limiting their access to prisoners. Several of Sarah's volunteers, intimidated by the process, stopped coming. Helms told Sarah during one particularly tense meeting that he thought it was time she faced reality. The county needed practical solutions to crime, not idealistic experiments. Men behind bars should be laboring in useful work, not reading poetry like ladies in a salon. Sarah replied, struggling to maintain her composure, that these men were human beings, not machines. They had minds that could be educated, hearts that could be changed, and futures that could be redeemed. Taking away their hope for betterment didn't serve justice. It served revenge. The philosophical divide between them was unbridgeable. Sarah believed in the fundamental capacity for human redemption. Helms believed in the immutable nature of criminal character. As 1908 progressed, the tension escalated. Helms began investigating every aspect of Sarah's program, looking for violations of protocol or evidence of impropriety. He questioned prisoners about their interactions with Sarah, hoping to find something that would justify shutting down the program. Sarah, aware of the scrutiny, became even more careful about following every rule and regulation. She documented every lesson, kept detailed records of every interaction, and ensured that she was never alone with prisoners. But Helms was patient and thorough. He knew that if he could find even the smallest irregularity, he could use it to destroy Sarah's reputation and end her work. The trap was set in motion in February 1909. Thomas Garrett was a new prisoner, a handsome man of 30, who had been convicted of embezzlement from the bank where he worked. Unlike most inmates, Garrett was well educated and articulate. He had been a star student in Sarah's classes, progressing rapidly in advanced reading and mathematics. What Sarah didn't know was that Garrett had been recruited by Helms to create a compromising situation. The sheriff had promised Garrett better treatment and an early release recommendation in exchange for his cooperation. The plan was simple, but devastating. Garrett began staying after lessons to ask questions about literature and philosophy. He wrote poems and essays that he shared with Sarah, seeking her advice and encouragement. Gradually, he began confiding in her about his regrets and his hopes for the future. Sarah, always responsive to students who showed genuine interest in learning, spent extra time helping Garrett with his studies. She was touched by his apparent remorse and his eloquent expressions of gratitude for her teaching. What she didn't realize was that every private conversation was being observed and documented. Every moment of extra attention was being recorded as evidence of inappropriate favoritism. Every kind word was being twisted into something sinister. In March 1909, Helms received the evidence he had been seeking. An anonymous letter, written by Garrett under Helms's direction, claimed that Sarah was having an improper relationship with a prisoner. The letter, addressed to the county prosecutor, was deliberately vague but highly suggestive. It reported suspicious behavior witnessed at the county jail, claiming Miss Sarah Smith spent excessive time with one particular inmate and that their interactions appeared to go beyond appropriate teacher-student relationships. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. Helms presented his evidence, records of extra time spent with Garrett, copies of poems the young man had written that could be interpreted as love letters, and testimony from guards who had been coached to report suspicious glances and inappropriate familiarity. Sarah was devastated when she learned of the accusations. She had always been scrupulously proper in her conduct, never spending time alone with prisoners, never engaging in personal conversations beyond what was necessary for teaching. When confronted with the allegations, Sarah told Helms these charges were absolutely false. Her relationship with Miss Garrett, as with all her students, had been entirely professional. She had done nothing improper. Helms replied coldly that the evidence suggested otherwise. Multiple witnesses had reported behaviors that violated prison protocols and called into question her moral fitness to work with inmates. A formal hearing was scheduled for April 15, 1909. Sarah spent sleepless nights preparing her defense, gathering testimonials from former students, volunteers, and community members who could attest to her character. Robert Chen, now released and working as a translator, wrote that Miss Smith saved his life with words. She never showed anything but kindness and respect to all students. She was a good woman, a pure woman. These charges brought shame to those who made them. John Peterson, whose letters to his daughter had become a local legend, testified that Miss Smith treated every one of them like human beings worthy of respect. She never showed favoritism to anyone, never acted in any way that wasn't completely proper. She was the closest thing to a saint he had ever met. But the deck was stacked against her. The hearing was conducted by County Judge Harrison Blackwood, Commissioner Blackwood's brother, and the prosecutor was a close political ally of Sheriff Helms. Sarah's character witnesses were dismissed as biased, while the coach testimony of guards and prisoners was accepted without question. The most damning moment came when Thomas Garrett took the stand. Under oath, he painted a picture of a lonely older woman who had become emotionally attached to him, who had written him personal letters, and who had made inappropriate advances. Sarah watched in horror as her kindness was twisted into impropriety, her dedication portrayed as obsession, her teaching transformed into seduction. When called to testify in her own defense, Sarah spoke with quiet dignity. She had devoted her life to teaching. Her only relationship with these men had been as their instructor. She had seen them as human beings capable of growth and redemption, and she had tried to help them achieve that growth through education. She had never violated any protocol, never behaved inappropriately, and never crossed any professional boundary. These charges were not just false, they were an attack on the very idea that people can change, that education can transform lives, that redemption is possible. Her words were eloquent and heartfelt, but the outcome had been predetermined. On April 30th, 1909, Judge Blackwood delivered his verdict. Miss Sarah Smith was found guilty of violating prison conduct codes and engaging in inappropriate behavior with an inmate. She was hereby sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment and was permanently barred from entering any correctional facility in the county. The courtroom erupted. Several of Sarah's former students who had attended the hearing shouted in protest. Women from the Methodist Church wept openly. Even some of the guards looked uncomfortable with the verdict. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The woman who had brought hope to countless prisoners was now a prisoner herself, condemned by a system that preferred punishment to progress, revenge to redemption. As the cell door clanged shut behind her, Sarah felt the weight of injustice settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. But even in that moment of ultimate defeat, her spirit remained unbroken. If she was to be imprisoned, she would find a way to continue her mission from within. The Lancaster County Jail for Women was a grim place, far removed from the men's facility where Sarah had taught. It housed a mixture of women, some guilty of crimes born of desperation, others of moral failings as defined by a rigid society. Many were illiterate, most were poor, and all were forgotten by a world that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. Sarah's arrival caused a stir among both inmates and guards. Everyone knew who she was, the famous teacher who had been brought low by scandal. Some viewed her with suspicion, others with pity, and a few with the kind of hope she had seen so many times before in the eyes of her students. Her cellmate was a young woman named Margaret O'Brien, barely 20 years old, convicted of stealing food to feed her siblings after their parents died of tuberculosis. Margaret could neither read nor write, and she watched Sarah with curious eyes as the older woman arranged her few possessions in their shared space. Margaret asked if Sarah was really the teacher lady who taught the men to read. Sarah replied simply that she was Sarah Smith, and yes, she had taught reading and writing to men in the county jail. Margaret mentioned that people said Sarah had done something wrong with one of them. Sarah met the young woman's gaze steadily and said that people say many things. What matters is what you believe and what you choose to do with that belief. Over the following days, Sarah observed the rhythms of prison life for women. The conditions were harsh: inadequate food, poor sanitation, and a complete absence of educational or rehabilitative programs. The women spent their days doing laundry for the men's facility, mending prison uniforms, and sitting in their cells with nothing to occupy their minds. It was heartbreaking and familiar. Sarah had seen the same hopelessness in the men's prison before she started teaching. The same vacant stares, the same resignation to a life without possibility. Within a week, Sarah had made her decision. If the system wouldn't provide education for these women, she would do it herself, just as she had done for the men. It started small. Margaret O'Brien was her first student, just as John Peterson had been years earlier. Using a piece of charcoal and the back of an old envelope, Sarah began teaching Margaret the alphabet. Margaret asked why Sarah would want to help her when she had her own troubles. Sarah replied softly that in helping Margaret learn, she remembered who she was. The walls could imprison her body, but they could not cage her purpose. Word spread quickly through the women's quarters. Within 2 weeks, Sarah was teaching 6 women. Within a month, she had organized informal classes during recreation time, using whatever materials she could find or improvise. The guards initially turned a blind eye, perhaps out of respect for what Sarah had accomplished in the men's facility, or perhaps because the educational activities made their jobs easier by keeping the women occupied and peaceful. Sarah's teaching methods adapted to the constraints of prison life. She used songs to teach spelling, told stories to convey historical lessons, and encouraged the women to share their own experiences as a way of practicing oral communication. One of her most talented students was Elena Vasquez, a Mexican woman convicted of prostitution who spoke 4 languages but couldn't read English. Elena became Sarah's assistant, helping to translate lessons for the Spanish-speaking inmates. Another student was Dorothy Williams, an African-American woman convicted of vagrancy, essentially being poor and black in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dorothy had been born into slavery and had never had any opportunity for education. At 62, she was determined to learn to read before she died. After successfully reading her first complete sentence, Dorothy told Sarah she never thought she'd live to see the day when her old eyes could make sense of marks on paper. Sarah had given her a gift she could never repay. Sarah replied that the gift was in seeing Dorothy discover what was always within her. Sarah didn't give her the ability to learn. She simply helped her uncover it. As months passed, Sarah's informal school grew. She taught basic literacy, arithmetic, and even simple philosophy and ethics. The women began writing letters to their families, keeping journals, and expressing themselves in ways they had never imagined possible. The transformation was remarkable. Fights between inmates decreased dramatically. Women who had been sullen and withdrawn began participating in group discussions. Even the guards noticed the change in atmosphere. But Sarah's health was deteriorating under the harsh conditions. The inadequate nutrition, cold dampness, and stress of imprisonment were taking their toll. She developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, and she lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dr. Marcus Webb, who still served as county physician, was alarmed when he examined her during his monthly rounds. He told Sarah privately that she was showing signs of consumption. The conditions were killing her. Sarah replied with a weak smile that she supposed she'd better teach as much as she could while she still could. Her dedication only intensified as her health declined. She spent every waking hour teaching, writing lesson plans, or helping individual students with their studies. She created a lending library using books donated by sympathetic guards and visitors. One of her greatest achievements during this period was helping Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant convicted of theft, prepare for a high school equivalency examination. Mary had dreams of becoming a nurse, and Sarah spent countless hours tutoring her in advanced subjects. When Mary passed the examination with honors, becoming the first woman in the county jail's history to earn a high school diploma while incarcerated, Even Sheriff Helms couldn't deny the significance of the achievement. Dr. Webb told Sarah, after witnessing Mary's graduation ceremony, that she had done something remarkable. She had proved that education could flourish even in the most adverse conditions. Sarah replied that education wasn't about the building or the conditions. It was about the human spirit's hunger for knowledge and growth. That hunger existed everywhere, even there. As Sarah's 2-year sentence neared its end, the women she had taught began to panic. What would happen to their school when she left? Who would continue their education? Sarah had been thinking about the same question. With Dr. Webb's help, she had been corresponding with women's reform organizations across the country, sharing her experiences and methods. Several groups had expressed interest in funding a permanent education program for incarcerated women. More importantly, she had trained several of her students to become teachers themselves. Elena Vasquez could now conduct basic Spanish literacy classes. Dorothy Williams had become expert at teaching adults to read. Margaret O'Brien, now literate and numerate, was preparing to take a teaching examination. On the day of Sarah's release, June 15, 1911, nearly 50 women had gathered in the common area to say goodbye. Many were crying not just for the loss of their teacher, but for the fear that their newfound hope would leave with her. Sarah told them in her farewell address to remember that education was not something that could be taken away from them. Once they could read, they would always be able to read. Once they understood that they were capable of learning and growing, no one could convince them otherwise. They carried the school with them wherever they went. Margaret O'Brien, now 22 and preparing for release herself, spoke for all the women. She said that Miss Smith came there as a prisoner, but was leaving as their liberator. She hadn't just taught them letters and numbers. She had taught them that they mattered, that their minds mattered, that their futures mattered. Sarah's release received no fanfare. No journalists waited outside the prison gates. No crowds gathered to welcome her. The world had moved on, and her story had been largely forgotten by everyone except those whose lives she had touched. She emerged from prison a changed woman. The 2 years of harsh conditions had aged her beyond her 47 years. Her hair was completely gray, her face deeply lined, and her once robust health permanently damaged. But her spirit, though tested, remained intact. With nowhere else to go, Sarah made her way to the Benedictine monastery of St. Scholastica, 20 miles outside Lancaster. The Mother Superior, Sister Catherine Marie, had been following Sarah's story and had written to offer her sanctuary. Sister Catherine explained during their first meeting that they had a position for a librarian. The work was quiet, the pay was modest, but Sarah would have a home there for as long as she needed one. Sarah accepted gratefully. The monastery's library was a peaceful haven after the chaos and noise of prison life. Surrounded by thousands of books, she began the slow process of healing, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Her duties were light but meaningful. She cataloged new acquisitions, helped visiting scholars with research, and taught basic literacy to young women who came to the monastery seeking education. It was a different kind of teaching, but it satisfied the same deep need to help others learn and grow. In her spare time, Sarah began writing. She kept detailed journals of her experiences in both the men's and women's prisons, documenting the transformative power of education behind bars. She also wrote poetry, finding in verse a way to express the complex emotions of her journey. One poem, written in 1913, captured her philosophy about finding what was truly real behind walls of stone and steel, where hope seemed lost and spirits broke. She wrote about how a teacher could find the human soul that none could take, about how walls might hold the mortal frame and bars might block the light of day, but minds set free could rise above and find their own unfettered way. Sarah also began corresponding with prison reform advocates across the country. Her experiences had given her unique insights into the potential for rehabilitation through education, and her voice became influential in the growing movement for prison reform. She wrote articles for educational journals, consulted with state officials developing new correctional policies, and mentored young teachers interested in prison education. Though she could never again teach in a prison herself, her ideas and methods continued to spread. In 1915, the Ohio State Legislature passed the Prison Education Act, which mandated basic literacy programs in all state correctional facilities. The legislation was directly influenced by Sarah's work and writings, though her name was not mentioned in the official records. Mom showed me a copy of that law. Sarah never received credit, but her influence was everywhere in the language. The words about human dignity and potential for growth were her words. Sarah lived quietly at the monastery for 21 years, her life a model of service and dedication. She never married, never sought publicity or recognition, never expressed bitterness about the injustice she had suffered. Young novices at the monastery often sought her counsel, drawn by her gentle wisdom and evident peace. One sister who arrived at the monastery in 1925 later wrote that Sister Sarah, as they called her, though she never took vows, had the gift of seeing the best in everyone. She treated the youngest postulant with the same respect and attention she would give to a bishop or a scholar. As Sarah entered her 60s, her health, never fully recovered from her prison years, began to fail more noticeably. The persistent cough developed into chronic bronchitis, and she suffered from recurring bouts of pneumonia. Dr. Webb, now an old man himself, continued to attend to her medical needs. He told her during one of his visits that she had given everything she had to give. She didn't need to prove anything more to anyone. Sarah replied with a smile that she wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just trying to be faithful to the gifts she had been given. In the winter of 1932, Sarah contracted a severe case of pneumonia. At 68, her body no longer had the strength to fight the infection. She died peacefully on February 14th, 1932, surrounded by the sisters who had become her family. Her funeral was a simple affair, attended by 3 people: Mother Superior Catherine Marie, Dr. Marcus Webb, and a man in his 60s who had traveled from Kentucky specifically to be there. The man was John Peterson, the first prisoner Sarah had taught to read and write. Now 65 years old, he had lived an exemplary life after his release, working as a church groundskeeper and never again running afoul of the law. His daughter Mary, now a teacher herself, had often spoken of writing to the woman who had taught her father to write to her. Peterson told Mother Superior Catherine after the service that Sarah had saved his soul. He couldn't read his own name when he met her, couldn't write a letter to his little girl. Miss Smith didn't just teach him letters, she taught him he was worth something, that he could be better than his worst mistake. Sarah was buried in the monastery cemetery under a simple stone, marked only with her name and dates. No mention was made of her achievements, her sacrifices, or her legacy. For 40 years, her grave was visited only by the sisters and the occasional former student who remembered her kindness. The world moved on, and Sarah Smith became another forgotten woman in the long history of unsung heroes. Mom said this was the most painful part of the story for her. To think of all those years when our family was ashamed of Sarah, when the world forgot about her. All that time, she had been a hero. But in 1972, a remarkable discovery changed everything. Professor Janet Morrison, a criminology student at Ohio State University, was researching historical approaches to prison rehabilitation for her doctoral dissertation. While going through archived records at the Lancaster County Courthouse, she discovered a water-damaged box that had been overlooked for decades. Inside were Sarah's original lesson plans, hundreds of letters and essays written by her students, documentation of her Word and Grace program, and detailed records of recidivism rates that proved the effectiveness of her methods. Most remarkable of all was a letter written by Thomas Garrett, the man whose false testimony had destroyed Sarah's reputation. The letter, apparently written shortly before his death in 1943, was addressed to whoever might find it. In the letter, Garrett confessed a terrible sin before his death. In 1909, he had given false testimony against Miss Sarah Smith, claiming she had behaved improperly with him while he was a prisoner. This was a lie, told at the request of Sheriff George Helms, who wanted to destroy Miss Smith's prison education program. Garrett wrote that Miss Smith never did anything wrong. She was the finest, most moral person he ever knew. She treated all her students with kindness and respect, and she changed many lives for the better. He had carried the guilt of his false testimony for 34 years, and he died knowing that he helped destroy a good woman who deserved only praise for her service. He prayed that someday the truth would be known, and Miss Smith's reputation would be restored. She was a saint, and he was the worst kind of sinner. Professor Morrison's discovery led to a complete reevaluation of Sarah's story. Academic articles were written, historical societies took notice, and efforts began to officially clear Sarah's name. In 1975, Judge Harold Blackwood Jr., son of the judge who had convicted Sarah, issued a posthumous pardon and formal apology. Based on new evidence that had come to light, it was clear that Miss Sarah Smith was the victim of a terrible miscarriage of justice. Her conviction was hereby overturned, and the court extended its deepest regrets for the injustice she suffered. More importantly, Sarah's educational methods were studied and implemented in correctional facilities across the country. The Smith method of prison education, emphasizing dignity, individual attention, and the connection between literacy and rehabilitation, became a cornerstone of modern correctional reform. In 1978, one of Sarah's former students, Margaret O'Brien, now in her 80s and a retired elementary school teacher, attended the dedication of the Sarah Smith Education Center at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Margaret told the assembled crowd that Miss Smith always said education was about more than reading and writing. She said it was about recognizing the dignity and potential in every human being. She saw that dignity in all of them, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Today, Sarah's legacy lives on in countless ways. The Sarah Smith Foundation provides funding for literacy programs in women's correctional facilities. The annual Sarah Smith Award recognizes outstanding educators who work with disadvantaged populations. And in the Ohio State Education Museum, a permanent exhibit tells her story under the title Words That Set Us Free. But perhaps her greatest monument is not made of marble or bronze. It exists in the lives of the hundreds of people she taught to read, in the letters they wrote to their children, in the books they discovered, in the hope they found in the darkest moments of their lives. Every time a prisoner learns to read, every time an adult student writes their first letter, every time someone discovers that education can transform lives, Sarah Smith's legacy continues. Her story reminds us that true greatness is not measured by fame or recognition, but by service to others. That one person, armed with nothing more than patience, kindness, and the unshakable belief in human potential, can indeed change the world. Mom finished the story and closed the box with the documents. Here we were, she said, 115 years later, and she was finally telling me the truth about our family. I understand now why I've always been drawn to social work, why I chose to work with troubled teenagers at the shelter. It's in our blood. Sarah left our family not shame, but a calling to help those whom society turns away from. I sat there in Mom's kitchen, holding these precious documents, and for the first time in my life, felt a complete connection to my family history. Sarah wasn't ashamed to be hidden, but an inspiration to be followed. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes, but simple teachers' dresses. Sometimes the greatest revolutions don't happen on battlefields, but in classrooms. And sometimes the most important victories aren't those that make headlines, but those that happen quietly, one life at a time. Sarah Elizabeth Smith was a hero, and I'm proud to be her great-great-niece.